Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Lamed test contains 3 short Mishnayos, ending off with the third Mishnah. From the beginning of the Daf until the first Mishnah is concluding the Gemara's discussion about a cooked dish or a bread that was made by ingredients that belong to 3 different people, and Rav Yehuda's opinion as to what tchum the bread is restricted to. The first Mishnah will discuss the differences between a fire and a coal, one of the differences being where its tchum is, and the Gemara and the Mishnah will discuss the 5 differences between a flame and a coal. The next Mishnah will discuss water that's in a well, whose tchum it has, depending on whether the well belongs to an individual or to a city or to the general public. Tomorrow we'll get into the topic of borer again and a machokis about the water, which also brings us back to the subject of borer. And then we'll conclude with a Mishnah about somebody who has his fruits in one village and he's in a different village. What tchum do those fruits have? So again, tchum is the area in which one is allowed to travel throughout Shabbos or Yom Tov. It is 2,000 amos outside his place of residence. He can move his place of residence by making an eruv and have 2,000 amos around that new place of residence, even if he's not in it. His objects also are restricted to his tchum, and there we have a case in our last Mishnah about a dish, a cooked dish, or a bread that's made of 3 ingredients. Let's say the dough was made out of flour, water, and salt, and Rav Yehuda had said that if 3 different people contributed or lent to another individual those 3 ingredients, then the bread has the restrictions of all 3, and it cannot travel anywhere outside the tchum of all 3 of them. It can only be in the area in which all 3 tchumin of all 3 people overlap. So Rav Yehuda says there that water is different. The Tanakama holds that it's all that the bread and the cooked dish have the restrictions of all 3. Rav Yehuda says they do not have the restrictions of the water. So the Gemara here asks 2 kashas on this, because our Mishnah seemed to say that Rav Yehuda says you don't have to worry about the water, and that's because when you look at a bread you don't see water, and therefore the water is batal and it's not significant. But Rav Yehuda, though, seems to hold that the salt is significant and the bread is limited to the tchum of the owner of the salt. So Mar says there's a brayso where Rav Yehuda says both the salt and the water are irrelevant in the bread. You're not limited to that tchum. You're only limited to the tchum of the owner of the flour, because when you look at bread, all you see is flour in a solid form, but all you see is the flour itself. So the Gemara answers there's 2 different types of salt. One is talking about melech sedamis, which Rashi explains is very fine and therefore you can't see it. It doesn't have any effect on the volume of the bread. And the other one is called melech astrokonis, which is thicker and does have an effect on the volume of the bread, and therefore you do see it, and it's not batal, and you are limited to those restrictions. That's what he was referring to in our Mishnah, where he only said that the water is not significant, but the salt is considered to be significant. Now the Gemara has another contradiction here. Our Mishnah had said that the cooked dish and the bread both have this halacha that Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to worry about the water, but we have a different brisa where Rabbi Yehuda says it's only the bread we don't have to worry about the water, but the cooked dish you do have to worry about the water, because the liquid that appears in the dish itself is evident and it's obvious and it's visible. You see the liquid in the cooked dish, and therefore you cannot say the liquid is batal, and you are restricted by the owner of the liquid's tchum. So Gemara says, how come in our case he says that the liquid's batal, but over there he says that the liquid is considered significant even in a cooked dish, not only in the bread? So my answer is 2 types of cooked dishes. One is very thick and you do not see any liquid in it. That's where you don't have to worry about the owner of the water. You're not restricted to his tchum. The other is talking about where it is watery and there is liquid that's obvious and visible. There you do have to be restricted to the tchum of the owner of the liquid. Okay, now we begin our next Mishnah, and it talks about the tchum of a flame and the tchum of a coal. A coal and a flame are both forms of fire, but they're different in that the coal has a mamoshes to it, has a solidness to it. The flame is just energy. There is nothing solid to it, and therefore it's not considered to be an object as far as many halachos. The Mishnah will list the difference between the halachos of the coal and the flame as far as tchumen, and then it'll go and bring 2 other differences And the Gemara will quote a Beitzah that repeats those three differences between coal and flame in halacha, and it'll also add two more areas in which there's difference between coal and flame in halacha. And so then we have a total of 5. What are these 5? So the first one is, what is the tchum? The tchum of the coal is the owner of the coal. The flame has no tchum at all. The Gemara will discuss how you move a flame exactly, how do you carry a flame from one place to another, but the flame has no tchum. A flame is not considered to be an object, and therefore it's not limited to any tchum. Next halacha is about hektish. A coal which belongs to hektish, nobody else is allowed to use it. If he uses it, he's mo'il. He violates the issue of using hektish. A flame, however, does not have any body to it, and therefore there is no isser me'ila. The Mishnah, though, does say that there is an isser of hektish. You're not allowed to use it. You can't use the flame for your own purposes. You're not allowed to benefit from the flame. However, there's no isser. There is no carbon me'ila that you bring if you do. Last halacha in our Mishnah is if you carry it outside in Rishos Harabim on Shabbos. If it's a coal, it's an object that has a body to it, and you violate the isser of carrying. If it's just a flame, you don't violate the isser of carrying. And again, the Gemara will explain how can you carry a flame. Now, the Beitzah that the Gemara brings adds two other halachas. One is avodah zarah. If the flame or the coal belongs to avodah zarah, if it's a coal that belongs to avodah zarah, it's usher to use. It has a body to it. There is an isser that rides upon the coal. If it's just a flame, again, it's not an object, and you cannot have any isser at all. It's mutter to use it. There's no problem using a flame that belonged to avodah zarah because it doesn't have any mamashas to it. The last halacha that the Beitzah brings is if somebody forswears and he says, I'm not going to have any hana from anything which belongs to my friend, or I guess my enemy, he is not allowed to use that person's coal because it is considered to be his possession, but he is allowed to use his flame because, again, it has no object, it has no body to it, and therefore it's not a possession. So the Gemara wants to know, why is there a difference between hektish and avodah zarah? How come hektish, we say it's usher to use a flame that belongs to hektish, even though it has no body to it, but it's not usher to use a flame that belongs to avodah zarah because it has no body to it. There shouldn't be a difference between those two things. They should be the same. So the Gemara says the difference is that in hektish is an isser d'Rabbanan. We're afraid if you allow you to use a flame that belongs to hektish, you'll end up using a coal that belongs to hektish. You make an isser d'Rabbanan. Avodah zarah, we don't make such an isser because people naturally are repulsed and repelled by avodah zarah, and therefore they're not going to use a coal that belongs to avodah zarah. We don't have to make gzera d'Rabbanan on the flame which belongs to avodah zarah. Now, as far as the case of carrying, the Gemara has a contradiction. Our Mishnah says that there is no isser to carry a flame, and there's a Beitzah that says that there is an isser to carry a flame, and the one is chayav a carbon chatas if he carries a flame in Rishos Harabim. The Gemara says contradiction between the two. The Gemara answers that's talking about where the flame is attached to something. The Gemara gives two options. Either it's attached to a stick that's burning, or it's attached to a shard, or it's attached to a kli that you rubbed with oil and it's burning in that. If it's attached to something, it's a much more significant flame. Then it's considered to have a mamashas to it, and therefore you would be chayav for carrying that flame out into Rishos Harabim. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? You're carrying the stick and you're carrying the kli that it's on. Why aren't you chayav for that? Gemara says it's referring to where the stick is less than the minimum shear required to violate an isser d'oraisa of carrying. The minimum shear of carrying wood is that it can fuel a fire long enough to roast an egg. The minimum shear for carrying a kli is that if it's broken, which is what we'll say, that the shard is large enough to use to wedge between a window frame and a wall, so that it's positioned correctly. If it's smaller than that, there's no isser. So therefore, this Mishnah, this Beitzah that we're referring to, is referring to where you have the flame burning on one of those two things. There's no isser d'oraisa for carrying the stick or the shard of kli, but there is an isser for carrying the flame. And here the flame does carry an isser because it's considered to have mamashas to it because it's burning on something. The Gemara says, so what's our case? Well, how you carry a flame out if you're not burning on anything? So the Gemara says you blow the flame and you're able to move the flame into Rishos Harabim by blowing it, but it's not attached to anything. But you're not holding it by anything, it's just being blown. And now we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses the tchum of water that is in a well. So the Mishnah discusses three types of well, three types of ownership. The first one is a well which is owned by an individual. The water in there belongs to him, so it's limited to his tchum, whatever his tchum is. The next is one that belongs to a municipality. So the Mishnah belongs to all the people in the city. It has the tchum of the city. It's considered owned in partnership by all the people in the city if it's a municipal water source. The last one is if it's a public well, which the Gemara refers to as the well of the Oilei Vavel, that the Klal Yisrael dug the well when they came to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel. So that's public. It's not owned by anybody. So the Gemara says that has no specific owner, and therefore it has no tchum of its own, this Mishnah holds. But when somebody fills the kli from the well, then that water has his tchum. The one who fills it up, that's the tchum that he has. So Gemara asks, first of all, there's a contradictory Mishnah that says that you have public water sources. It has the if you have privately owned water sources, it has everybody's tchum. It does not have any. It does not have the tchum of the owner. It's can be spread to everybody, meaning it has no tchum limitations at all. The Gemara says the difference is that's talking about flowing water. Flowing water you can't view as your property and it belongs to you. You just have the river. You don't necessarily have the specific water that's flowing past you, and therefore that's not limited to any tchum at all. So the Gemara has a question about the public water sources that we said were created by the Ole Vavel, and therefore they belong to everybody. Where's the machlok is what if one person drew water for somebody else? We had said that halacha was that the person who draws the water, it's his tchum. What if person A draws water and the intent that it should go to person B? Whose tchum does it have? So this is a machlok between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says it belongs to the person who drew it. Rav Nachman says it belongs to the person that it was drawn for. So the Gemara is going to try to figure out what the machlok is about. So the Gemara first says machlok is about when what is the halacha of these wells? Is it considered that they belong to nobody, that they're hefker? Or is it considered like they belong to everybody in partnership? Now, Rav Nachman will hold they belong to everybody in partnership, and therefore when person A draws the water for person B, it's person B water. It's his water. It's being drawn for him. Since it's his water, it gets his tchum. Rav Sheshes will hold that it's hefker. And the halacha is when a person tries to take something for hefker for someone else, like if you see a lost object and you pick it up with intent to be claimed for someone else, it doesn't work. And the reason is because you can't do a kinyan for one person when you're costing other people. By taking it out of the realm of hefker, nobody else has the ability to get that. So you can be zachan la'adam shegafanav, as we say. You can credit somebody, you can help him, but not if it's also hurting others. So you cannot, therefore, make this hefker object belong to him. In the same vein, you can't draw hefker water and have it go to somebody else. So when he picks up the water, it does not belong to the person that he drew it for, and therefore it has to go to somebody, so it goes to the person who drew it, and therefore it gets his tchum. Now the Gemara has a kasha here. According to what we're saying, Rav Nachman holds that the hefker-owned wells, the public wells are considered hefker. They don't belong to anybody. Not that they belong to everybody, but that they belong to nobody. Gemara says, but we have a clear statement of Rav Nachman who holds otherwise. He holds that they belong to everybody. What's that? It's talking about a case where people are moder hana from each other. They forswear they promise that they're not going to get any benefit from each other's possessions. So the Gemara has three cases. Case one is where someone says, my things, I am a chayrim to you. I am a chayrim to you. That means you can't use my things. Well, if he says, however, the second in the case, you are a chayrim to me, that means I can't use his things. If they say we are chayrim to each other, then they're not allowed to use each other's things. Anything which they own in partnership, they're not allowed to use either. However, things which belong to the Oli Bavel, they are allowed to use. Things which belong to the people of the city, they're not allowed to use because that's for sure considered owned in partnership by everybody in the city, including them too. Now, what are the things which belong to the Oli Bavel? So Gemara says the Harabayis, the mountain that the Beis Hamikdash is built on, the Lishkos, the offices in the Beis Hamikdash, the Azaros, or the yards, the courtyards in the Beis Hamikdash, and a well along the road, these wells that we've been speaking about. So, you see clearly in this statement of Rav Nachman that wells are considered to be permitted even for two people who forswore hana from each other. That means that Rav Nachman holds that they are considered to be not owned by anybody. They're considered to be hefker, which is not like what we said earlier, that Rav Nachman, according to his opinion, that they go to the second person, has to be because he holds that they belong to them b'shutvis. So the Gemara therefore says now we have a problem with what we're going to say that Rav Nachman holds. Just to finish off the statement that he said there, he also added that what are considered to be things that belong to the city in general, the streets, the shul, the bathhouses. So here's the kasha that we have. So the Gemara wants to say that the answer is that when do we say that wells belong to everybody and they're not allowed to use the well that they own? They're not allowed to use a publicly, they're not allowed to use a public well because it's considered like they own in partnership. That's talking about if they want to bathe in the well water. The reason is because when they bathe in the well water, they're using all the water, and a partner isn't allowed to use the other partner's water. However, in a case where they're just drawing water, there is no problem to draw the water, and that would be permitted. And therefore, Rav Nachman could really hold that they are partners with each other. Why is drawing water from two partners, why is it not considered to be drawing from the other person's water? Simple. When you draw your water, we view it as if when you draw water from the well, you're not drawing the other person's water. The fact that you took this water out is revealed that this must have been your water all along. Like the concept of Breira, which we always have. I don't know whose water is which. Each person owns half the water. Whatever water you pull out, and we now figured out that this is the water which belongs to you. So Gemara says, so because of Breira, therefore we could say that even though people own things in partnership, they would be allowed to use each other's well. They would be allowed to use a publicly owned well, even though they own it in partnership. It's not considered like they own it as hefker. So therefore, we're going to say as follows. We're going to say that really the Ole Bavel, the publicly owned well, belongs to everybody as a partnership. And even though there's a Mishnah that says that partnership-owned wells, if they forswear hana from each other, they're not allowed to use it. That's to bathe, where they're using everybody's wells. Here, the reason you're allowed to use it is not because it's hefker and it belongs to nobody. It's because it's considered to be owned in partnership, but we hold of breira. So when it says, but I'm going to show you that Rav Nachman does not hold to the concept of breira. Where do you see that? Rav Nachman has a statement about two brothers who inherited an estate from the father. So there are two halachos that are relevant to inheriting an estate from the father. One of them is about giving a kalbon, and one of them is about meiser behema. The halacha is that there's a difference between whether you have a partnership in which two people own animals together, that they bought it together, they purchased it as partners, or whether you have an estate which owns something and two people own the estate in partnership. Those two different things. Now, Meiser Behema works as follows. If it's owned by a partnership, there's no obligation of Meiser Behema. If it's owned by an estate and that estate is controlled by two partners, there is Meiser Behema. Kalbon is the halacha that you have to add an extra small coin to your Machdis HaShekel donation to the Beis HaMikdash to purchase public karbanos. Kalbon works the other way. You only have to give a kalbon for each partner if the partners own the animals or they own the property equally, jointly. If they own an estate and the estate owns the property, then they only have to give one kalbon. They don't have to each give a kalbon in their Machatzis HaShekel. Now, what happens when two brothers split their property and then they rejoin? Is it considered like they own the estate of their father, or is it considered like they've rejoined and they have made a deal, they've come together, but they each have their individual partnership? It's not that the property belongs to the estate and they control it separately. So Gemara says that it's a machlokes between Rav Anan and Rav Nachman. Rav Anan says it depends how they split up. If one said, look, I'll take the goats, you take the sheep, I'll take the males, you take the females, then it's considered like they bought their chelik from each other because they didn't split things evenly. They exchanged. I'll take this, I'll take the goats, I'll take all the goats, I'll take your share in the goats in exchange for my share in the sheep. That's a purchase. That's considered like they own it in a partnership, not as an inheritance where they each own the estate. If, however, they split it evenly, you take half the sheep, I'll take half the sheep. You take half the goats, I'll take half the goats. So then they each own part of the estate. And when they rejoined back together, they went back to the original plan of the estate, and therefore would have halachas that they own the estate itself. Now, Rav Nachman, though, says otherwise. Rav Nachman says even if they split it that way, they're each considered like they bought it from each other. Each one bought his share from the other one in exchange for what he gave him. So the Gemara says this is a breira issue, because Rav Anan's position reflects breira, because what's he saying? He's saying that when they split half and half, and each one is saying that this was mine all along, I inherited half of it, and I'm taking this half. And that's why it's considered like we own the estate. We each control the estate, and the estate belongs to all of us. According to Rav Nachman, however, he's saying that even when they split it, sheep against sheep and goats against goats, we view it as if we do not say this was their share all along. We view it as if they bought it from each other. That means that there was never a point at which we say, we're revealing by the fact that I took these sheep and you took those goats, that these were always mine and those were always yours. we view it as if they purchased it from each other. That means that he does not hold of Breirus. And the Gemara says, you're right, we're going to have to reject this whole approach. We have to come with a totally new approach to explain the machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes about the well water in the public wells. Why does Rav... And the Gemara therefore says we have a new approach. Now, what we say is as follows. What happened is that the person drew the water and he actually gave it to the other individual. And the machlokes is, was he koned himself or not? Everybody agrees when he picked up the water for somebody else, he can't give it to that person. And everybody agrees that the water was hefker. Okay, so we're all discussing that the water is considered to be hefker. It's not owned in partnership by everybody. When the person picks it up, he cannot be makne it to the other person. The question is, though, was he koned himself when he picked it up? If he had intent to be koned for somebody else, was he koned or not? According to Rav Sheshes, he was koned himself. He intended to pick it up for somebody else, but he couldn't. It doesn't work, so he was koned himself. Therefore, when he actually gave it to that person, it still got his tchum. According to Rav Nachman, however, when he picked it up for himself, he was not koned it. And therefore, when he gave it to the other person, it has that person's tchum. It did not have any tchum at all when the first person picked it up, because didn't belong to that individual. When he gave it to the second person, that's when he gets a tchum. This concludes the Gemara. And now we get to our last Mishnah on the Daf. And the Mishnah discusses somebody who lives in one city and he has fruits in a different town. And people of that town are coming to his city if they want to bring him his fruits. So Gemara says they shouldn't bring it unless it's within his Erev Tchumen, because those fruits are limited to his Erev. If it's within, if they can move, if their Erev Tchumen includes his town, doesn't mean that they can bring those fruits, because those fruits have his tchum might not include their town, and therefore they would not be able to move those fruits from outside his tchum to inside his tchum, because they would be limited to his tchum halachas, and already outside his tchum is not allowed to move them. Now, if, however, it is within his tchum, so then they are allowed to bring them. Now, somebody who invites guests to come to him on Yom Tov, and he wants to send them home with some food that they could have for their next meal, he can't do that, because that food has his tchum, and they have their own tchum. So if they're going to a place that's outside his tchum, they can't bring that food. The only way to do it is if he was mezakeh it to them before Yom Tov. That is, he gave it to somebody else and said, be koneh this for them. Then it belongs to them already from before Yom Tov, and then it has their tchum from before Yom Tov, and then he's allowed to.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.